Brent. I would like to start for English.
Hello everybody, good morning. Welcome to the Rainfed seminar of Brent. Is going to present some climate change results of his crop modeling simulations. Brent Riechelman has a bachelor's degree in plant science from Wageningen University. He's currently in the last phase of his master studies in plant science. His master thesis was on bioeconomic modeling on farming systems in the Netherlands, aimed at more efficient use of manure and land. So the last part of his study is an internship here in CIMMYT to learn more about crop modeling and climate change. So,
Well, thank you for the introduction, Diego. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see that despite the early time for the people in Mexico, so many people showed up. I need to do an internship as part of my master study at a company or a research institute, and I decided to come to CIMMYT. I arrived here 4 months ago, and in these 4 months I've been working on this climate change impacts on wheat production in the Indo-Gangetic plains. We did that with crop modeling, and in this presentation I will first explain to you what the Indo-Gangetic plains is. This may be a term that's not familiar to everyone. I'm going to tell you why it's a relevant region to study. Then I will go into some basics of how I did the crop modeling and the impact on wheat production. Then I will share some of my results and the implications of those results. Afterwards, there is some room for questions. So if you have any questions, please keep them in mind, and we might have some nice discussion afterwards. So the area I studied is over here. It's in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India. And the Indo-Gangetic Plains is a region within this region, roughly about here. And it's a very important region because a lot of food is being produced here, especially rice and wheat. And I've been focusing on wheat. And food production is really important because, as you know, this is a region with a large population, and the projections of this population is that it's going to increase in the coming decades. So producing more food, or at least not less food, is really important to avoid people going hungry. So in this map, I included the intensity of wheat production in the area that we studied. So you can see that it's mostly in this Indo-Gangetic plains along the border of Nepal and India, in Indian Punjab, Pakistani Punjab. This is where most of the wheat is, and most of this wheat is also irrigated. So the blue areas is where almost everything wheat production is irrigated, and the red areas is where almost everything is rain-fed. And while about 24% of the total area under wheat cultivation is rain-fed, this only accounts for 11% of the total production. So you can say that most of the wheat produced in this part of the world is under irrigated production. And this irrigation is really nice because it increases the yields a lot compared to rain-fed production, but it also causes some problems in some regions because more water is being extracted from the soil than that is replenished. And this makes it harder and harder and more expensive to pump up water for irrigation. And in some parts, this also creates problems with soil salinization because salt groundwater starts to mix with the fresh water, and this is just not great if you use that water for irrigation. So that's an introduction to what the Indo-Gangetic Plains is and wheat production in this area. And then I arrived at my crop modeling methods. So I used 3 crop models. We use 3 crop models instead of 1 because every model is a simplification of reality. There are always some aspects that a model does not take into account. But if you use multiple models, you create an average, if you want to say it that way, and you are more accurate. You're closer to reality. So these models that we used are mechanistic crop models, meaning that they try to capture real biological processes in like the calculations. These models are sensitive to temperature, to the amount of water that's available, and to nitrogen, and several other things, but these are the most important thing. So I studied irrigated production and rain-fed production separately. So in irrigated production, you sometimes add water when there is not enough water, and in rain-fed production, the crop just depends on how much rain there is. These 2 production systems also have their own nitrogen fertilization rate. Depending on which country there is, you use a high amount of nitrogen for the irrigated production and a lower amount for the rain-fed production. We used 10 different cultivars, 10 different genotypes that depend on the environment. So you'll have a different crop or a different genotype in a hot and wet environment than in a dry and cold environment. Throughout the region, we had 27 different soil profiles, which the crop models take into account. And for the historic baseline, which we use to calculate what our yields like right now, we collected daily weather data. So the crop models, every day they look at what is the weather this day, what's the temperature, how much water is there in the soil, how much water falls down, and then it calculates every day. This is the development of the crop, this is how much growth we have, and it does that from the moment it's being sown to the moment it's being harvested. So for the baseline, for the historic production, you can sort of collect weather data. That's not possible for the future. So for the future, we used 5 climate models that, given certain parameters, predict or calculate future weather, future climate. And again, we used multiple models to reduce the uncertainty coming from a model. Well, I hope it's sort of clear now how we did it. Then I'm going to present the results. So on the left, you see irrigated production with yields of about 3 to 5 tons, and the highest production around the border with Nepal and in the north of Pakistan. And on the right, we see rain-fed production, a lot lower than its irrigated counterpart, yields of about 1, sometimes 2 tons, with an exception in the north of Pakistan, where there is for some reason, there is a nice patch of production. So these maps are an average over this time period to account for strange weather on a certain year, and we did the same for the future. And I could show you the maps, the production maps of the future projection, but then it's very hard to compare what actually changed. So I calculated what the change is between our future projection and this baseline, and that gives us these maps. I also included what the average yield change is per country. So for irrigated production, there is about a 15 to 20% change in or decrease in yield in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. This is because the temperatures in these countries are already relatively high. If you increase the temperature even more, then biological processes go faster, the crop develops faster, meaning that there is less time in which you build a biomass, there is less time for the crop to fill the grains with starch and protein and everything that's in final grain fruit. So this ultimately reduces the yields. In Nepal, the story is a little bit different. This is a country on high altitude. It's a lot colder there. So when you increase the temperature, the processes just go more optimally and you get a slightly higher yield. Well, that's the story for irrigated. That's about what I expected. And then for rain-fed production, the yields seem to increase. Looks really nice, about almost a 20% increase in India and a slight decrease in Bangladesh. So you might wonder, okay, we don't need this irrigated production anymore, we can just rely on this rain-fed production. But you have to remember, this is only a small area right now, rain-fed production, and the yields are still very low. If you have 1,000 tons, a ton yield per hectare, and you increase it by 20%, you still have a very low yield. And this is not going to feed India or Pakistan. So if you, so it looks very, very rosy, it looks very nice, but it's not that great. And now if you recall the story about the irrigation water use and the problems that are arising from excessive use of groundwater, we were thinking about that and we thought, okay, what if we cannot use irrigation in the future anymore? What if so much water is being extracted, management is so bad, that irrigation is not possible? What will the production look like in the future? So we made this map, and this is a comparison of the baseline of rain-fed and irrigated production in the baseline together, and then the change compared to rain-fed production in the future. So there are a few very red areas here, and these are areas where there is irrigated production in the baseline, but no rain-fed production. So what you get when you compare irrigated production in the baseline with just rain-fed production in the future, you have nothing, there is no production. So you have 100% decline in yield. And then there are some green patches that show up, and this is the other way around. This is where in the baseline there is some rain-fed production, but no irrigated production. So if you, with the green map for rain-fed production that we just saw, that gives these green patches. But overall, the decline in yield is very severe. It's about 50 to 70%, and that's gonna be very, very bad. So we try to quantify this in economic terms as well. What are these scenarios going to mean for the economies? So I made these small tables per country. BAU is business as usual. What's the national production per year going to be if nothing changes from now? There's no climate change. Things just go as they are. And then the normal climate change and the worst case scenario where there's no irrigation possible anymore. And you can see that in Pakistan and India, the economic losses in these scenarios run into the billions of US dollars per year. And in Nepal and Bangladesh, the numbers are not that big because the production in these countries is a lot lower. But no one's going to like these losses as well. So how do we continue from here? What can we do about this? Well, I think it's very important that from what we can learn from this is that this irrigation is really important in this area. So people need to avoid a future where irrigation is not possible anymore. And of course, this scenario is a little exaggerated, but it does illustrate the point of the importance of irrigation. So there are several things that farmers can do to conserve groundwater. the pumping up of irrigation water is currently heavily subsidized, so the farmers don't really suffer the consequences of their maybe excessive use of irrigation. So there's a role for governments to change this. In general, climate change, higher temperatures, there are breeding options that can be explored, perhaps via modeling studies. And there are some management options that look promising, that might help, like sowing earlier to avoid heat in the most critical periods of the crop's development. Policy can help to support farmers and supply chains to adopt practices that conserve groundwater and that allow people to adapt to the effects of climate change. So this was my presentation. I hope everything was clear. If not, you feel free to ask some questions. And finally, I'd like to thank CIMMYT for allowing me to come here and for partially funding my internship, allowing me to work and learn here. So, thank you. Any questions? Olaf?
Yeah, thanks. If you could go back to your slides where you had the irrigated and the rainfed next to each other. One of your first...
This one?
Sorry, the one where you were showing the green, go back one?
Climate change.
Okay, sorry. No.
Climate change.
Yeah, this one, yeah.
Ah.
So you were questioning why there's the green areas on the rainfed. But that's basically, at least on the northern area, you have the Himalayan foothills. So like in Pakistan, so with climate change, you were seeing under rainfed that there's a positive effect on rainfed wheat.
Mm-hmm.
So that's largely on that side. And then if you go back to your one of the last, where you had the comparison of the aggregate numbers.
This one?
Okay, well, sorry, here is the green areas in the north. Yeah, that's basically the Himalayan foothills in Pakistan and the northern states of India.
So here?
That area. Yeah, you were questioning why it's green, but that's basically because of it's relatively higher. So it would maybe be good to also overlay an altitude layer. So the Indo-Gangetic plains is basically flat, and as you go south, it becomes a bit higher or more undulating. But especially up in the north, the Himalayan foothills is a big explanatory factor why, with in Nepal, etc., you see less effects. So if you go to your one, the last, the one where you have the aggregate numbers, towards the end, sorry.
This one?
This one, yeah. So here, actually, you say that Nepal is winning in terms of climate change, even under the worst case scenario. It's a negative loss, meaning a positive.
No, sorry, that might be a little confusing. So the other ones have economic loss, and this is economic change, because there is a gain in under climate change, an economic gain, but a loss under the worst case scenario, because the irrigated production in Nepal also.
Well, that's no. If you stay there, I mean that's likely confusing, because then in Pakistan, India, etc., you all have positive numbers on economic loss.
Yeah.
Yes. And then Nepal, it's.
But this says economic change. I know it's not.
No, just for consistency, easier for the audience to, if you use the same so then it becomes easier. But now indeed I see what you're referring to. Thanks.
Any other questions? What?
Please go to the Rainfed and Irrigated climate change. This one. Actually, I'm not sure you. Okay, thank you. I'm not sure because you explained that why irrigate reduction is around 80%, but rainfed increase around 20%. They both under the same climate scenarios. So you explain irrigate because temperature increase, but for rainfed, the temperature also increase.
Yes.
So how to explain that? And also, normally, I think the north place have a higher temperature, but in the irrigated situation, there are, in the north part, there are 10% increase. So why?
So on your second question, in the irrigated situation, there is an increase here?
Yes, you have a number, 10% around.
Oh, here.
For Nepal.
Yeah, that's because it's relatively cold there, so the temperatures go more towards the optimum temperature for wheat, and that's.
But what's the best temperature? How you can? I think we need to know the best temperature in the growing season and to see is in the optimal range or not, and to how much increase.
Yeah, you're right about that. I don't have the exact numbers on this. That could be something to look into. On your first question, why does the rainfed production seem to increase despite temperatures also increasing? So we're still trying to figure out why this is exactly. But my current hypothesis is that because this production is very much water limited, shortening the growing season may actually help because there is less water being extracted during the vegetative stage, meaning that there is more water available during flowering and grain filling, so there's less terminal drought stress. And additionally, higher carbon dioxide concentrations also improve the water use efficiency, further helping the crop conserve water and use water more sparingly.
But I mean, if the growing season shorter, they also will affect the yield.
Yes, of course, the potential yield will be affected. But you're never having potential yield in this rainfed production because it's so much water limited.
Yeah, so it basically boils down back to your original statement when you first presented this slide, is that you're starting from an extremely low base compared to the case with the irrigated production, where you are very close to your optimum already. So these are actually systems that are very difficult to compare, and therefore focusing very much on the positive and negative in both cases doesn't really make that much sense.
Yeah, I don't know if the irrigated production in this case really is near the potential, but it is true what you're saying, that because production is so low in this rain-fed system, a very small change already gives a large relative yield increase.
Just two quick questions. Have you also tried to change or look at sensitivity of cropping calendar in the future? I mean, there might be some shift in the cropping season or rainfall season that might explain that. So second, I mean, you said you use 3 crop models, and have you seen any biases, or do they behave well? I mean, behave expectedly, or have you seen anomalies between those 3 crops?
Yeah. So let's start with your first question. Change it, like you mean? Have I looked into other large changes in rainfall patterns, and does that?
So, I mean, did you use fixed planting window for both cases, like current and future, or have you also looked at some kind of adaptation measure?
So the question was, have I looked into fixed planting, or did I use fixed planting days or non-fixed planting dates, and have I looked into adaptation strategies? Right. So I have not really studied adaptation strategies in this study, but the planting dates are not fixed. There are two winter wheat varieties. They have their planting window within October, and the models, they use a certain algorithm to determine, okay, when are we going to sow, but it depends on temperature and water availability. And for the other varieties, it depends on the location when their sowing window is. And they also use an algorithm to determine when in this sowing window are we going to do the sowing.
So, if you haven't, I think it will be interesting to look at exactly how many days the shift might have happened. I mean, I have seen the cases, the algorithm is not usually, I mean, so sometimes they behave a little bit erratically. So, I mean, you might need to double check if that algorithm really does pick the optimal window given scenario, or sometimes it just goes into the first available water moisture whenever it happens and just doesn't change much.
That's an interesting idea. Thank you. Any other?
I'm wondering what would happen if you calculated with the future varieties.
So the question is, what will happen if we calculate with future varieties? So do you mean with traits or bred for climate change? Well, like I said, I haven't studied adaptation strategies right now in this study, so I can't say. But you would expect that with some, if you would do a modeling study with breeding for certain traits, that at least some of them, or a combination of some of them, would at least not suffer these consequences for yield, or maybe even improve in yield.
Just to add to that, I think some years ago, with a project called Global Futures, which somehow initiated the whole modeling background here. At the very beginning, we discussed virtual varieties, which is what Simon is referring to. And we've been trying to, I think Jabu did it in drought-tolerant maize,
Yeah.
So some things like more root mass, or deeper roots, you can represent relatively easy, but there's some other adaptation traits that are not so easy to put into the models. But it's something that's being discussed, and obviously it's one of the errors here in the whole setup, that we only know about what we have at the moment. We think, or we're trying to represent what we might have in the future, where from the genetic side we also get some mitigation potential. It's on the way, we've done it with some, but not before.
Thank you, Kai. Any other questions, comments, remarks?
So which crop model did you use, and are they different?
So we used crop models within DSAT, series, CropSim, and wheat.
Oh, you're all within DSAT.
Yeah.
Just going on to Jabu's question about the dates. I assume that much of this is rice wheat, right? So the previous crop is probably rice in much of this area.
Yeah.
The Indo-Gangetic plain, I know that that's typically the case.
Yeah, yeah.
And as you look at that, you're probably going to see a shift in the whole system, really, because with the changes in the rainfall patterns, the sowing dates for the rice are going to affect when the wheat goes in, because really, for the most part, what limits the planting date for wheat typically tends to be when the rice comes off. So I would imagine that will play quite a big role, and that might be interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I haven't looked into too much how climate change is going to affect the cultivation of rice. So I don't know if the monsoons will be earlier or later, or whether they stay in the same period. And indeed, the harvest of rice does limit when you can sow your wheat. So part of the management adaptation strategies that could be used is to use shorter varieties of rice if you want to boost your wheat production. A lot of the rice currently being cultivated is to my knowledge, is being burned, and then people plow their fields several times to be able to prepare it for wheat. This takes a long time, so there are some people working on directly seeding wheat into the rice stubble, so you can pretty much immediately sow wheat after harvesting the rice. So that would also help you to be able to sow earlier. But yeah, ultimately you need to also know what happens with the rice if you really want to study adapting the wheat cultivation. Or change the system completely. Anyone else?
Just one last comment. Yeah, I understand why you picked the no irrigation as the extreme worst case scenario, but I think it sounds too extreme.
Yeah.
I think you have to have some kind of intermediate kind of range, spectrum of possible scenarios, not just this is the worst, boom, and that's the thing. Yeah, it might not be so, conceivable. That's something.
No, I agree with you that that's a scenario where there is no irrigation possible at all is exaggerated. Because not everywhere in this region there are water problems. Some areas there's too much water. So this is really intended as as an illustration of how important this irrigation is, and having intermediate scenarios with less irrigation, or maybe with more location specific, there is less irrigation or no irrigation here, might be an improvement on this. Yes, Matthew.
Should I wait for the mic?
Yeah. Please wait for the mic.
So I see you have a CO2 scenario of 572. I assume that's what it is.
Yes.
Does the model make any assumptions about how that impacts night, temperature responses, heat shocks, and periods of rather severe drought? As a physiologist, I don't see how CO2 would have any impact on any of those. It's certainly not a positive one. What's the model doing with that information?
That's a good question. I don't know how the CO2 concentrations affect night temperatures or heat shock, but I do believe that CO2 concentrations affect the gas exchange of the plant, and how often stomata are open. So I think that's a part where the CO2 really affects, and on the other aspects I don't know.
Yeah, that's certainly true that with a mild drought, the CO2 can be helpful, but with a more severe drought, that's not the case. I'm asking because when we look at average effects, some of these important details can get lost out, and you're not predicting a very positive scenario anyway.
Mm-hmm.
In this situation, and with some of these other factors, things could actually be quite a lot worse. So just something to think about for the next iteration.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So, just one more question.
Just small question, because in the future the irrigate also increase, but I'm not sure what's the rainfall change. Because in my case, China, some region will be increase the rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can put the baseline rainfall and future change, and it's better for authors, for the reviewers to know how is that change.
So if I understand you correctly, you suggest to use the baseline rainfall in the future?
I mean, you can show data like how much is the rainfall right now, and we can see whether it's enough or not enough, and also the future rainfall change. We can judge is the rainfall maybe affect the irrigate, the rainfed yard.
Yeah. Yeah, I have not delved too deeply in how much the rainfall changes. I've made a very brief comparison, and it seems that the rainfall in this region doesn't change that much, but there may be some places where it does. Yeah.
Any other question? I'd like to thank Brent for this presentation. Thank you everyone for coming.